Welcome again to the very last, actually, of a six-part series on human rights and environmental due diligence in public procurement, which has been brought to you by Electronics Watch, Industrial, the Fair Trade Advocacy Office, and Rethinking Value Chains, with the financial support of the Charles Leopold Mayer Foundation for the Progress of Humankind. My name is Björn Claesson. I'm Director of Electronics Watch. Electronics Watch coordinates monitoring and remediation of worker rights issues in electronic supply chains on behalf of a large number of public buyers in both Europe and Australia. The moderator today will be Alice Sunigalia, and I'm going to turn it over to her shortly. But first, I want to go over some important technical points so that you can better participate here. First of all, as you just heard, there is interpretation in this webinar. Speakers will be speaking in English and in French, but if you want to listen to French, Spanish, or English, this is possible. You just click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select the language that you want. If you should need technical assistance, please look for Martina Hooper in the chat and send her the question. Also, if you have questions as we go along, questions for the presenters, then please also find Martina in the chat and send her the questions, and she will be reading the questions at the right time in the webinar. Finally, a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available publicly at the Electronics Watch website after this webinar. So a brief introduction to this session and to the series, as we're coming to the very last one in this series, as I mentioned. So a recap. Each session of this series is focused on a key building block of due diligence. The first one addressed transparency in supply chain, which is fundamental in any due diligence process. The next one focused on verification, how to measure and verify effective due diligence from a public procurement perspective. The third session addressed enforcement of due diligence, and the fourth was about the right to effective remedy. The fifth session was about the role of purchasing practices of both public and private buyers in the human rights and environmental due diligence. So we have covered transparency, verification, enforcement, remedy, and finally purchasing practices. Each one, again, a key building block in the due diligence process. But public buyers need ongoing support to incorporate these building blocks into the procurement process. And that is why we're having this final session about just this, the support available to public buyers in the field of human rights and environmental due diligence. We will soon have some inspiring case studies about this kind of support that is available to public buyers, and we'll have experts to share their reflections with you. But first now, I'd like to turn it over to Elena Lunder of the Fair Trade Advocacy Office for an introduction to this event.
Thank you, Björn. This is Kuma. She sometimes joins me on camera. In this cooperation, as part of the series of sessions, the Fair Trade Advocacy Office is mainly coming from the perspective of corporate sustainability due diligence, which is the legislative format at EU level of human rights and environmental due diligence. So I will kind of introduce the approach that we've been taking as part of each of the individual session, so that we can put also today's conversation into the context of human rights and environmental due diligence. It's quite a new technical term that kind of surfaced about 10 years ago based on the process of due diligence from the corporate world, looking at possible hidden risks to the company, but it has been translated into possible hidden risks to rights holders and the environment from the side of a company. And until now, we mainly speak about the responsibility of businesses on how to implement human rights and environmental due diligence. We've seen legislation pop up in different member states of the EU, also forms of such legislation in the UK, in Canada, focusing more on reporting elements. And the EU is also working on such an instrument. European Commission published a proposal for a legislation codifying an obligation to conduct due diligence in February this year. And just today, about an hour ago, we found out that the Council adopted their position to this proposal. This will be their negotiating position with the European Parliament in their negotiations towards the final text of this directive. In the light of these developments, we are also looking at what this means for public procurers. So from the perspective of due diligence, we look at the responsibility a specific entity has for the impacts of their supply chain on human rights and the environment. And in this sense, we often hear also the point that the same should be true for public buyers as it is for private buyers, especially also looking at the impacts that this can lead to. The problem here is that even already for companies, it is it's a technical procedure that will require certain reorganization of internal business as usual, of how the departments are connected to each other, how the corporate strategy reflects any new findings from the due diligence process, and how this is then at the end, as we covered over the last sessions, monitored, verified, enforced, and then also addressed in cases of violations, so mitigated and remedied. So similar questions as for companies arise also for public authorities, but they're not part of this legislation. They're also not part of the mainstream conversation about supportive measures. So it's really difficult, considering that there are different sizes of public authorities with different capacities to introduce new policies or new frameworks, as for example this one. So the conversation today becomes really important, speaking about how public authorities of different sizes can move ahead, adopting similar policies, and then at the same time what is needed for them to be able to do so. So this is how Alicia's work is key in progression of public procurement, which includes human rights and environmental due diligence. And without further ado, I would just hand the word over to Alice Sinigalia. As mentioned by Björn, we used to collaborate within the Fair Trade Advocacy Office, but now Alice works as an independent consultant on this topic.
Thank you very much, Elena and Bjorn. I really look forward to moderating this session. My name is Alice Sinigalia, and as already said, I'm a consultant in the field of public procurement. And actually, I really look forward to exploring with you who are the key stakeholders at local, national, European, or even international level that can provide further support to procurers to deal with HREDD, human rights and environmental due diligence, because as it has already been said, this is a new topic for many procurers. And so, of course, being a new topic, procurers need knowledge, support, expertise to be able to integrate responsible business conduct in their daily work. And in order to introduce this discussion, I wanted in particular to focus on three key needs of procurers, so that we can start our reflection on who could better support procurers and where synergies could be built across different stakeholders. So just to open the conversation, I wanted to highlight a first need of procurers in this field. As already anticipated by Elena, of course, applying human rights and environmental due diligence in procurement implies for procurers to adapt their tendering process, the way they they manage contracts, the way they deal with suppliers. And so the first question of today is who can help procurers learn from existing good practices, who can support the replication and the upscale of innovative policies, practices, and procedures. So this is the first concern I wanted to raise with this introduction of today. And apart from this, a key need of procurers in this field concerns the skills, the competencies, the knowledge that procurers need to acquire in this area of work. So, of course, the second questions to be discussed today is who can help procurers build their capacity and provide them with training, peer learning, knowledge sharing opportunities. And then, of course, this webinar will help discuss about how we can optimize the use of financial and human resources in the field of public procurement. So who can help procurers use effectively the resources they have, and also how we can create synergies so that resources can be better used among the stakeholders that are involved in this process. A key point to be raised in this introduction is that, of course, if public procurement was seen in the past as clerical work, and nowadays a more and more a strategic tool that can be used to achieve social and environmental objectives. And of course, this requires a set of competencies, resources, and skills that were not so much developed in the past. And this webinar, we find it very interesting, in particular at the end of this series, to explore who are the other allies that can help us advance in this area. And actually, just to open the conversation of today, we tried before this webinar to identify who are a few of the stakeholders that can help procurers. And we decided to start with the example of central purchasing centers, because of course, a way for procurers to apply to integrate responsible business conduct in procurement is to delegate the purchase to those that have the capacity to deal with HRDD. So procurers can buy goods and services directly from central purchasing centers, and or they can buy goods, services, and works through contracts such as framework agreements that are set up by central purchasing centers. So we identified these stakeholders as a first example of supporting organization for procurers. Of course, more and more countries within the EU and also beyond are setting up or set up competence centers and other national supporting agencies that actually can provide stakeholders with resources to deal with HRETD. They can provide training, guidance, toolkits, collections of good practices, but also opportunities to engage with the market or to participate in policy dialogues. So, of course, these competence centers are also, in our view, key stakeholders to be involved and to rely on in order to support procurers. And actually, the case studies that we will explore later will concern examples of competence centers and central purchasing centers. Of course, procurers can also be supported by participating in formal, informal coalitions of public authorities or other stakeholders, such as civil society organizations or trade unions. There are also relevant awards, like I'm thinking about Procura Plus or New Cities for Fair and Ethical Trade Award, or there are fairs and events or webinars like the one of today that can provide procurers with support. But in order to focus our attention in today's webinar, we decided to focus on 2 examples and then discuss about these examples and other stakeholders we could include in our picture. And so I'm really happy to start introducing the case studies and giving the floor to our speakers. We will have 2 case studies. One is Union de Groupement d'Achats Publics, the Central Purchasing Center from France, UGAP. And then we will have OECD National Contact Points for Responsible Business Conduct. This will be our 2 examples of today to start the debate with you. And I'm very happy to give the floor to Stéphane Beauvais, Public Policy Manager at UGAP, who will let us know more about what does UGAP do and also how can procurers buy more sustainably by delegating the purchase to Central Purchasing Center. So I'm really happy to give you the floor, Stéphane.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you hear me well, and I hope you see my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes, very well.
Okay. So, as said, I work for UGAP. UGAP is a central purchasing body who sorry. Yes. Our way to work is very specific in Europe. We buy by tender to the suppliers, and we sell all the product we have selected to public clients without tender. As we bought by tender before, we can sell without a tender for all public actors in France. So it's government, local government, and hospital. And we began to sell in Belgium 4 years ago. We are a public company. Our turnover is about 5 trillion of euro each year, and we sell product in transportation, computer, medical equipment, services, furniture, etc. So our way to manage the human rights and environmental question takes place in 2 parts of the life of a contract or of a tender. The first one is during the tender, and the second one is during the management of the contract, because the life of the contract is longer than the life of the tender, in fact, and the real things happen during the contract. So during the tender, we ask a lot of questions to the suppliers in their submission. And if I do a focus specifically about human rights, we will ask them to describe the action they have implemented to control all the social aspects in the production chain, and also all the action about the health and the safety at work for all the people who work for them or for their own suppliers. We do the same for the environmental question, but I just described specifically for human rights. And during the management of the contract, we have several ways to act. The first one, we use a website where all our suppliers have to put the documents which show that they are in conformity with the law. So it's a digital platform. It's a common platform for a lot of public buyers in France. And for some contract or some tenders, sometimes, for instance, in the equipment to protect persons, to protect the bodies, we can ask a social audit in the submission. And if this audit is not given during the submission, the supplier can't have the contract with us. And sometimes in certain situation, we decide to assign our own auditor. So we have a contract with some auditors, and we will ask them to check what happens in France, but in Europe, or sometimes very far from France, how the things are leaded or managed by our suppliers, even in the human rights question, but also for environmental questions. Of course, sometimes there is bad or wrong situations. We have certain reflex. We don't name and we don't shame about a supplier who was in a wrong situation with us. The first point. The second point is when, except when the situation is very, very bad, in this situation, we can break the contract we have with the suppliers, but we prefer to help them to improve his situation. So we prefer, in general, ask him to have a progress plan, and we will check for several months how this plan is leaded in order to improve the situation. We consider that it's our responsibility to help our suppliers to improve, because in the future they will work maybe with us, but maybe with other public buyers. So it's a good thing for everybody, in fact. So as I told, we are a buyer in order to sell. So we also have an action in direction of our customers. And we try to do two things. The first one is before our client will buy something to us. So we need to give him, or he needs to have from us some information about the environmental question and human rights question about the product we can sell or the services we can sell. So we try to let a lot of information on our website. Sometimes it's connected to the product, and sometimes it's a more general information. It's clearly not enough today, but it's difficult to be totally transparency in a good way. So we want to sell the truth. So we want to say, well, we are not at the good level when we are at the wrong level. It's important, and it's not totally easy to explain all the situation, and especially all the difficulties to reach some objective or goals we can have. And the second action we have, it's when the customer have bought the product, we try to give him a lot of information about all he bought from UGAP, sorry, and we give him some individualized statistic about the product. So for instance, the board you can see on the middle of the right, it's a board which concerns the second life product we can sell to a client. And the first board give information about where are the suppliers of UGAP, and especially the supplier he bought the product. So are the suppliers SMEs? Are they French SMEs? Are they local SMEs? Compare the situation, the geographical situation of our clients. We consider that we have to give this information to our clients. So the goal is to give a maximum of information before the client buy and a maximum of information after he has bought all the product. So in order to do all that things, we discuss often with a big number of stakeholders. I think I don't have the time to describe all of them, but we discuss with suppliers during the contract. We discuss with potential suppliers. We discuss with the professional federation, of course, with our client also, because we consider that they have good practice and we can copy the good practice, of course. We have some partners who help us to better describe all the requirements we can write in a tender. We have European counterparts like the CPB network. It's a network of central purchasing bodies. And also we have our trusted third parties. It's like auditors, and we want from them to tell us if we have the good behavior with our suppliers, and especially with our suppliers which are SMEs. So we consider that all that stakeholders have also some interest to discuss with us, because we can share our practice, and also we can share all the difficulties we can meet in each goal in public policies we want to lead. So sometimes they can help us to go over a difficulty, and sometimes we help them to discover a difficulty they didn't imagine in the past. So, of course, the big part of the job of the work is in front of us. There are a lot of difficulties to us, but I can describe two in particular. The first one is the suppliers' capacities to help us to do better, especially because suppliers sometimes are not able to determine what in their product we can assess in order to select the product. We can't consider in public procurement all the social responsibility of a company, so we have to focus on the product only. And we need, in the case of UGAP, to have a maximum of data. So we need that this data come from the suppliers. It's not easy, and we need to be able to treat all this data. So we need to improve our own information system. So it's a big part of time and money from us. And these 2 points are the main difficulties we can meet today to improve our action in responsible public procurement. I have finished.
Thank you very much, Stéphane Beauvais, for your presentation, for having explained what a central purchasing center does, how a procurer can be supported by central purchasing centers, and where there are areas of improvements and synergies with other stakeholders. So thank you very much for your presentation. And actually, we would like to introduce the second case study. And I would like to give the floor to Lena Diesing, policy analyst at the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct, who will let us know how a national supporting organization, such as National Contact Points for Responsible Business Conduct, can help responsible public buying become a common practice and provide procurers with expertise in this area. So very happy to give you the floor, Lena.
Thank you very much, Alicia. And yeah, I'm happy to speak to you about the national contact points for responsible business conduct. I think I want to clarify a little bit that obviously national contact points will not be the magic remedy, but rather today I want to make a plea for greater coordination across governments, and notably on a topic like due diligence in public procurement, or public procurement and responsible business conduct. So we have two sides essentially that are coming together here, two different policy sides, and so I think there's a lot to gain if we bring the two together. So what I would like to do today is basically three things. On the one hand, say a little bit about the OECD and the guidelines for multinational enterprises, which provide the context for the national contact points. I'll introduce the national contact points, and then a little bit more about the role of government as a whole when it comes to responsible business conduct, and what we've done there to bring public procurement into the mix. So you probably all know the OECD. On the screen, you see the kinds of things that we do. We're an international organizations bringing together governments to find solutions to common challenges, develop global standards, share experiences, and identify best practices. And actually, one of these standards is something that I would like to introduce to you now. It's the guidelines for multinational enterprises. Some of you might have seen this before. The NCP are a responsibility of governments rooted in these guidelines for multinational enterprises. The OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises are the most comprehensive instruments on RBC. That's because they cover all kinds of areas included in responsible business conduct. You see that on the screen in the colorful tiles. And so they're really relevant for all sectors. As I mentioned, there's a responsibility for government, but also a responsibility for businesses. You see that on the left side and on the right side of the screen. And then something to mention in this context is also that the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises create a responsibility on due diligence that is very broad and encompassing. So it's not just human rights, not just environment, but due diligence on all of these topics that you see on the screen. Governments have a responsibility to implement the OECD guidelines and also to create the enabling environment for businesses to conduct business responsibly. And the focus today is also one of these responsibilities. So as part of this enabling environment, governments have the responsibility to set up national contact points to promote responsible business conduct and facilitate access to remedy. Just a quick word on the adherence to the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. At the moment, we have 51 adherents to the guidelines. You see them colored here in yellow on the screen. And what I really want to emphasize here is that the guidelines have a truly global reach, not just because we have so many adherents, but also because these adherents represent over 70% of foreign direct investment and over half of world trade. So while you see some that are colored in yellow and others are not, at the same time, the supply chains, the value chains of those adhering to the guidelines for multinational enterprises extend across the globe and reach much further than what you see in yellow. And I think this is really an important point of the reach of these guidelines and how far the commitment of these countries actually reaches. So let's look at the national contact points for responsible business conduct and their mandate. The guidelines are the only responsible business conduct standard that have this domestic implementation mechanism that really makes the guidelines unique. And if we want to break it down, we can say that the national contact points are national institutions that serve to implement the guidelines for multinational enterprises. And this mandate is also defined in the guidelines in an annex, and that contains a lot of information on how the national contact points are supposed to function. But the mandate is a really important piece, and so I want to speak about that today. They have a dual mandate that includes promotion and remedy. First, promotion essentially means to promote the guidelines for multinational enterprises, so make them known via promotional material, for example, on the website, but also events and activities around the guidelines. And then there's an important element in the context that we're talking about today, which is policy coherence. So part of the mandate of national contact points is to further policy coherence across government. The idea is here really that on the one hand, a government has committed to the standards set out in the guidelines for multinational enterprises, and that should be in coherence with government activity across the board. Obviously, as you can imagine, that would also include activities like public procurement, and so a little bit walking the talk as a government when it comes to responsible business conduct and responsible activity. So this is really where there is a possibility for national contact points to also interact with the public procurement systems. Then a second aspect of the mandate is to provide access to remedy by acting as a non-judicial grievance mechanism. I know that those are a lot of big and complicated words, and I must say when I was working primarily on public procurement, this did not mean a lot to me. So if we would break this down, what that actually means, and explain it in very simple terms, we could have the example of a company that somehow, engaged in some sort of misconduct or violated the guidelines, did something that is not aligned with the standards set out in the guidelines for multinational enterprises. And in those cases, interested parties can go to the NCP and ask the NCP to help resolve this issue. So provide some sort of way to address issues, harm in the supply chain. It's a non-judicial mechanism. I want to emphasize that. So that means NCPs are not courts. They're not part of the judiciary, but they're a remedy mechanism and a dispute resolution, so to say, that is outside of the court system. Then something that is important to keep in mind here as well, NCPs can act for anybody who has an interest to submit a case, so is linked somehow to the issue that we see. And that can either be in the country where the company is headquartered or where the company is operating. And so you really see that you might have a company that is headquartered in one of the countries that we saw highlighted in yellow, but where there are operations, where there are some issues somewhere else on the globe, and that really extend beyond these 51 adherents to the guidelines. So far, we have seen more than 600 of these kinds of cases, and they extend to, I believe now, more than 100 countries or territories around the globe. Now let's focus a little bit on this last aspect on specific instances. So this NCP mechanism and what that means in public procurement. So there is no formal link, but if we think about it a little bit more logically, where these kinds of specific instances come up, they have come up in the past in NCP cases. There have been issues related to public procurement, albeit not very often. And so there is a possible interaction between public procurement and the NCP mechanism. For example, we could think about a specific instance against a company for supplying a government with a problematic footprint. One of the examples that you can, by the way, look up in the NCP case database on the OECD website is where an individual filed a specific instance against the producer of the, the substances that are used in capital punishment, and basically said that by selling this substance to a government for the purpose of capital punishment, this company had violated the guidelines. Obviously, that's a very rare case and a very specific situation to think about. The next one is very similar in that sense, in that we might imagine a specific instance against a public buyer. There has been one example for that too, where we're talking about military procurement and the production of a military vessel that was allegedly produced using forced labor. And so the NCP was asked to resolve that conflict. And then finally, and we might see many examples, a specific instance against a company that is active in those sectors that are also relevant for public procurement: construction, garments, medical supplies. So not specifically on an actual public procurement case, but rather on products that might also be bought by governments. So I want to say that while it hasn't been acting in this way a lot, obviously specific instances would provide an opportunity for dispute resolution also in the context of public procurement. And that's also because the specific instance process is very time effective, it's very accessible, and it has a global reach. Now, before I come to the end, I want to share a few words beyond NCPs on the role of government when it comes to responsible business conduct, because we're talking on the one hand about the activities of businesses, but then beyond the NCPs, beyond public procurement, in the abstract, governments have a role to create this enabling environment. And so this is really to situate also where public procurement sits and why it's so important, actually. We see increasingly that governments pay attention to this, and they are aware of this important role to provide an enabling environment for responsible business conduct. And that is essentially happening in two ways. So these two different colors you see on the left side and the right side of the screen. On the one hand, there's regulation and enforcement on the different issues covered in the guidelines for multinational enterprises. So there are laws about human rights, there are laws about labor rights, there are laws about environment, anti-corruption, integrity, just to provide some examples. And the government is obviously setting the boundaries also of business behavior with regard to these issues. And then on the other hand, there is a role of the government to really leverage government activity and incentivize responsible business conduct through other policy areas. For example, through public procurement. Public procurement, as you know, has a huge volume, and with the high purchasing power of public buyers, it is actually a force in the market that we can pay attention to when it comes to responsible business conduct. And so this is kind of the overarching theme here. And in a way, the idea would be to bring these two sides closer together so that the one side of the government not only knows what the other side of the government does, but actually they can create synergies by really joining forces and working hand in hand. So with this in mind, the OECD has done a lot of work on this topic. I feel like I have to bring that in a little bit, but I also want to encourage you to seek out these sources of information, even if we're not talking about that today as a focus. But there is a lot of information on this topic and what public buyers can do, but also what other parts of government can do to support in the work of the OECD. We've just finished phase 1 on this OECD program on public procurement and responsible business conduct. We've done a lot of analysis. One of the first times that we actually looked at where do we stand in governments, OECD governments, and adherence to the guidelines when it comes to integrating responsible business conduct in public procurement. Then I already talked about it. We have two different policy communities, responsible business conduct and public procurement. And a lot of work in phase 1 was to bring these two sides together. And then we worked a little bit more on practice. So we ran a pilot last year focusing on the public procurement of garment and textiles and how to bring in due diligence there. And there's also a report on our website that gives a little bit of the insight there that might be really interesting too. And then last slide, and then I'm almost finished, just a sneak peek that we will continue to work on this kind of work, but really with the goal to not just have good practices here and there, but really bringing this into the common practice of public buyers and trying to provide support on that. I think the issue of prioritizing risk is a central element there. So we decided to focus on that. That's the second point. And the third point, something that I also picked up from Stefan's presentation, data is really key here. So that should be a focus as well for the next couple of years, trying to find out how can we support what we find with data and strengthening that point really. So that is all from me. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion later.
Thank you very much, Lena, for having concluded the first part of the webinar, which aimed to identify and describe existing supporting organizations for procurers. And I'm very happy actually to open the second part of the webinar, which is about gathering feedback and questions on the described good practices. And actually I hear from Martina that there is already a question for the speakers, and I take the opportunity to encourage all participants to write their questions to Martina Hooper in the chat. So Martina, I give you the floor to read the question.
Sure. Okay, so we have a question first for Stefan. When UGAP acts as seller, do your customers demand evidence of human rights due diligence that suppliers undertake and that UGAP itself undertakes?
I'm not sure to have understood. We ask evidence from our suppliers. Mm-hmm. In general, it's not often the case that our customers, our own customers, ask us some evidence about all the job we can do in order to check and verify. It's surprising, but it's okay. So it's not a reflex, an habit from the user from our customers to ask us that kind of evidence. That's right.
Okay, thanks. And we've got also a question for Lena. In a case where an NCP was asked to resolve a human rights issue in the supply chain of a public buyer, what would the process be? Can you outline the steps a public buyer should take and the steps the NCP would take?
Yeah, so actually we have seen only one case that was filed against a public buyer, and so that we really don't have a lot of examples on it. But maybe I can speak a little bit more about what kind of steps there are according to the guidelines in specific instances, because normally they're filed against companies. So if somebody feels like there has been a violation of a company of the guidelines, the person, organization can just explain that with the NCP, and many NCPs have forums on their websites where it makes it really easy for anybody who has an interest to file one of these specific instances. So I think number one would be to find out which NCP would be able to address this issue. And then the NCP usually reaches out to the submitter, but the specific formal step is the initial assessment phase, where the NCP looks into the matter and first determines, according to set principles in the guidelines, whether or not this specific case merits further examination. If it merits further examination, we have the second step, according to the guidelines, which is to offer good offices, which basically means offering the parties involved in the case, so the submitter and the company that is brought to the table, to resolve the issue with the help of the NCP as part of mediation in the good offices of the NCPs. And that follows an approach that we know from dispute resolution or mediation, bringing the two parties together and trying to find out how we can resolve the issues. That usually takes several rounds. And then once they have found a conclusion, once they have agreed, we are in the conclusion phase, where the NCP will publish a statement about the case. And then often there's also a follow-up phase. So a certain time afterwards, as agreed by the parties, the NCP would look into whether the parties have honored their agreement, really. So, but really the three steps that are set in the guidelines are the initial assessment phase, the good offices phase, and then a conclusion phase, which also includes follow-up after the case has been finalized.
Thank you very much for these extra explanations, and thank you also for the questions from the participants. I would like now to open the second part of the webinar, which aims to gather feedback on the case studies we analyzed. And actually, since we are speaking about supporting services and stakeholders for procurers, the first speaker I would like to introduce is a procurer, because of course their perspective is crucial in this webinar. And I would like to introduce Natalie Rothman-Boss, a public procurement project manager at the municipality of Bremen, which is a municipality with a long-standing experience in the field of sustainable public procurement. And so I would like to involve her and ask Natalie what is the experience of the municipality of Bremen with supporting organizations in the field of public procurement, where the support is more important, and perhaps where there are other areas of support that are needed. So thank you, Natalie, for your participation in the webinar, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. First of all, I'm sorry for my bad English, but I hope you all will understand me. And I am not a procurer, actually. I'm working for the Competence Center for Social Responsible Public Procurement, but I'm not a procurer myself. So we actually work a lot on certain projects which are funded by Engagement Global. So we receive a lot of financial support. They give us the opportunity for further development in our goals. So without the money, we wouldn't be able to do that. We do a project, for example, now we are working on a pilot tender for circular furniture and also textiles, and we want to look a bit deeper into the supply chain. And we also do a study which is called what kind of impact does circularity on the global south? So the financial support, as I said, is very important to us. And of course, the aspect of the networking. They have a big, or the Engagement Global, they have a big network and a big community, so we can exchange and learn from each other. They also provide a website called Kompass Nachhaltigkeit, where the procurers can actually can have some help with the tender creation. So you will find there some information for the labels and certain regularities for your own municipality. And yes, so they also provide us with some training. We also work together with other NGOs, Femnet, Christian Initiative, Romero, and so on. And well, I think the main point is actually the networking. So they provide us with knowledge, and we can learn from each other. In Bremen, we actually don't really have the kind of due diligence. In the tendering phase, we work with minimum criteria or requirements. So the bidders have to fulfill it in the social criteria. If not, so they are out of the tendering phase. And we also work with awarding requirements. So we develop a questionnaire where we ask the bidders if they have any mechanisms or plans for improvement of human rights situation along the supply chain, or do they have any mechanism or like a checking system if workers receive fair salary along the supply chain and so on. So if they fulfill all this and ask the question, they get some points. So at the end, the bidder who has more points actually receives then the tender. We actually are very happy with the support from the NGOs that we receive, and for the procurers themselves, I think I'm just look to my colleagues. I think we need to raise more awareness for certain topics like social and ecological topics. And of course, we also need some support also from the politicians and also from the department managers, so they support the procurers with the tenders. For now, we have some regulations in Bremen, like a regulation on the consideration of the core labor standard of the International Labour Organization in public procurement, and also regulation for social standards and competition in public procurement, which helps procurers to lean on the regulation to do their tenders. But of course, there's always room for improvement. So we're happy to work with non-government organization to help us to improve ourselves. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for your feedback on the support you receive from the stakeholders we present in the first part of the webinar. And actually, your presentation also helps me connect with the next speaker, because, of course, one of the objectives of the webinar was to identify what are also other stakeholders that can support procurers. You mentioned the role of civil society organizations. And actually now I would like also to speak with the next speaker, Gemma Friedman, about the role of trade unions as well. How can trade unions to support procurers, and also what synergies can be created between trade unions and the case studies we presented in the first part of the webinar. So Gemma Friedman is International Officer at the International Unit of Unison. And given your 20-year experience in the international trade union movement and the expertise on human and trade union rights, I would like to introduce you to the debate and to give you the floor, and to start by asking you how can a partnership with trade unions further support procurers in the field of human rights and environmental due diligence. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alice. So before I can answer that, I think I just need to set the scene a little bit more from a trade union perspective. Until Electronics Watch came along, I would say, municipalities and the public sector, other public sector authorities had no option but to spend very precious, scarce resources through an ineffective industry. And I would generally call that, as others do, the market assurance industry. In fact, I understand that that industry is going to reach about 200 billion US dollars in spend by 2027. But that industry at best just sticks plasters on infected wounds with its assurance. And it also pays for ultra smooth PR to minimize reputational damage. And at worst, it undermines trade unions, either directly or indirectly, and leads to trade union busting, which is basically preventing trade unions from getting recognition in the workplace and from getting collective bargaining agreements. So I think that needs to be our starting point. And so, for example, from a trade union perspective, tackling modern slavery, tackling extreme long working hours from the top of the supply chain won't be sustainable. It doesn't lead to genuine remedy for workers. I think we all know that. So from our perspective, we have to have a razor-sharp focus on resolving one of the fundamental root causes of the problem on top of purchasing practices. And that is that we've got a fundamental power imbalance at work between disempowered, vulnerable workers and their powerful, abusive, that's not in every workplace around the world, but in the instances we're talking about, powerful and abusive employers. And actually that can really only be achieved through having trade unions in a workplace with collective bargaining agreements. And these need to be democratic, free and independent trade unions. So yes, I mean, any partnership with the trade union movement is immensely welcome. But unfortunately, there are very rare circumstances compared to the size of the problem where this happens. How this should be done deserves a lot more careful time and thought than we've got here. But there are a few ideas. First of all, what kinds of partnerships are we talking about? Are we talking about partnerships from the top of the supply chain with a local, between a trade union that has got a collective bargaining agreement in a local authority, for example, or another public authority? Or are we talking about partnerships with trade unions at the global trade union level, like industrial? Or are we talking about partnerships with trade unions that represent workers in the factories or elsewhere that we're talking about? So there's quite a level of complexity, and what is possible and not possible is also complex within that, and therefore it deserves that careful thought and a strategic approach. Trade unions know their own workplaces in intricate details, they understand industrial relations, how their employers work, and they understand what the problems are within the workplace, even if they're not representing a specific factory, but they represent workers in a particular industry. They much more quickly and easily understand what the problems are. So they can supply information from the bottom upwards if they're able to get some form of access to the workers. But all trade unions have a fundamental similar understanding about industrial relations, employment law, etc. And therefore, even at a more basic level at the top of the supply chain can also provide a certain amount of knowledge and expertise and information that public procurers that don't have a grounding in trade unionism just naturally wouldn't know. And that's much more legitimate than trying to get that type of information than what an audit firm could supply. And therefore, trade unions can also help in working out what a decent audit firm might be compared to others. They can also help with looking at contract clauses and also understanding what a free, independent, democratic trade union should look like versus what a union that's been installed by management into a workplace would look like. Also, what trade union busting actually is and what that looks like. But also, we've got to be really realistic, because trade unionism reflects the countries and the industrial relations, cultures in which we come from. So a public sector trade union in the UK or anywhere else cannot be an expert in trade unionism in a sector like electronics or textiles or in agriculture. In the same way that a trade union in Sweden in the public sector is very different from, has lots of differences than a public sector trade union in the UK like Unison, because we have different challenges and we have therefore different types of approaches as well. And a trade union at the top of the supply chain doesn't necessarily know how to work internationally and across sectors. Why would it when it's set up to represent its own members? So like I say, this needs to be done through careful thought and being very realistic about where our starting points are. It can be a good journey, learning journey for all of us. Most important, I would say, is the best way to be is also that it should be a tripartite approach. That means involving the employer as well as the trade union, and also particularly if there are local authorities involved, so long as they're trade union friendly, the local politicians, because we need political will. And also we need intergovernmental organizations like the OECD to give far more attention, I would say, to enabling these types of partnerships with trade unions. It's a very underfunded area. And at Unison, we are recognizing this gap. We're really very unusual in this way. And we've been developing training so that we can do this type of work in the UK, focusing on mandatory human rights due diligence and on how to use this, the leverage of public procurement to open up the space for workers to be able to self-organize in their workplace without negative interference by the trade union, but by the employer. And we're also piloting how to do this in practice through a project with Electronics Watch and with Industrial Global Union Federation. So taken together, the training and the project can test exactly what I'm saying, and the results can be learned from and shared and hopefully scaled up.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, I also take the opportunity to ask all participants to share any questions they may have with Martina Hooper for the last part of the webinar. Actually, your presentation made me think about one of the aims of the webinar, which is to optimize the use of resources that procurers have. We have spoken a lot about how to optimize human resources, but it's also important to think about how we can optimize financial resources for the aims of this webinar. So actually, I wanted to give you the floor to also share your views on how financial resources could be also optimized.
Thanks, Alice. So I think let's start from a starting point that says that trade unions, in order for trade unions to provide information about what's happening on the ground in factories, they don't need to get on an expensive airplane. They don't need expensive hotels, and they absolutely do not have anywhere. I mean, most of them have poverty wages in the sourcing country, and most of the sourcing countries themselves. So we're not spending huge amounts of money there either. So just from that perspective, when we talk about being able to optimize resources, trade unions can represent very good value for money. However, often trade unions are very weak in those countries that we're sourcing from. And the reasons, I've explained some of that a little bit. The laws are often, there's a lot of union busting that is systemic that happens in global supply chains. Also, the labor laws in many countries enable that to happen. So there needs to be a real recognition of why the trade union movement can often be quite weak, or not as any of us would like it to be in those countries, but that's not a reason not to work with them. Because as I say, they can be extremely good value for money if we want to take it from that perspective. But also, you know, trade unions are human rights defenders, and the trade unionists are human rights defenders. And in fact, in Germany and in Norway, there is a recognition of this. So the human rights due diligence laws are written in such a way that to varying degrees, trade unions can be part of developing the due diligence response throughout the process and throughout the supply chain, but in varying ways. And it's a developing field, so we have yet to see good examples as far as I know, and it would be great if somebody could, if anyone does know about exactly how that can happen. So please write that in the chat or suggest it. So we need to be seen as genuine stakeholders and partners, and to be consulted at every stage. But it's not necessarily easy, as I've already alluded to, but we have to have a starting point of saying that we'd like to get to that point. And so, you know, national competence centres, central purchasing centres, unless they take a really thoughtful approach to this, can end up really just replicating what already exists out there. And that system is broken. And the sustainable solutions won't be found. So thinking about when staff are being hired, whether they have any experience of working within trade unions, thinking about how to involve the trade unions in the countries in which they're located, again, is a good starting point. They could be added to the table that was shown earlier on in terms of what can be brought to the table and how they can help the public authority. But like I say, the political will within the organizations and within within the politics of the country must be there, and it's absolutely not there in most places in the UK right now, apart from where there are local authorities that are Labour run. But even then, how to do it? It's with very, very scarce resources, and in some countries there are more than others. In the UK, there's barely any. So it's a really difficult question. But at the same time, trade unions also exist to represent their members. So you can also ask the question about why should a trade union put its own resources to spending money on this if we're at the top of the supply chain in the buying countries, when their own members are hugely struggling and rightly demanding attention. And actually it's their own members that democratically make their unions' policies. And some are not going to be interested in internationalism. So I'm just trying to be very honest and real here, that just because you decide to enter into this, that it's not necessarily, you know, all of a sudden you're going to start talking to trade unions that either know what they're talking about when we talk about global supply chains, or indeed that have got the resources and the political will within them to do that. But we do also exist. And I think that that's what makes Electronics Watch also a really great vehicle, because we are doing some of this type of work together, and it's difficult work. And at the same applies at the bottom of the supply chain. So why would a trade union that is constantly busted in an electronics union, why would they try to organize in places where their resources, where they're constantly busted, or where they have no members, or where there are almost solely migrant workers that don't speak the same language, etc. In Malaysia, an electronics union only gets a subscription fee, which is how trade unions exist, when they have a collective bargaining agreement in place, but they're always busted. So their precious resources are constantly used up on trying to fight to stop this union busting and to actually get a collective bargaining agreement. So it needs to work both ways. Support needs to come both ways. And we are, as far as I know, we're still the leading union internationally, a public sector union internationally, that is working in this space. And at the same time, billions of euros do exist out there, or hundreds of millions, that are often given, though, to organizations that are seen as less problematic or not radical. And actually, I don't know what is radical about having a trade union in the workplace. It's very rarely, directed at supporting trade unions to work in this type of partnership. And we're not going to change our agenda to chase funding. We're not going to dumb down what we do to chase funding. So I would say to any public procurer that really does want to do this, Electronics Watch is a great avenue and vehicle for this right now, because it does work and speak and respect seriously global trade unionists, those on the ground, and also trade unions like Unison. And so collectively, step by step, we need to start to find a way to fill this glaring resource gap, both for public procurers, but also for trade unionists.
Thank you very much, Gemma. I'm very happy that this webinar involved different stakeholders and perspective on this technical and complex topic. And actually, since this is the last webinar of this series, I'm also happy to give the floor to the organizers to give a final feedback on what they think about the exchange and what they think about the stakeholders we proposed for cooperating with procurers. So actually, I would like to give the floor to Electronics Watch and then FTAO for their concluding remarks. And thank you again to all the speakers.
Thank you very much, Alice. And this is actually not going to be my concluding remark, if that's okay. But at the risk of sounding like some kind of mutual back patting here between Unison and Electronics Watch, I do want to say that in our practical, I do want to emphasize that there's actually a really good business case for working with trade unions in human rights due diligence. Gemma started talking along these lines, and so what we do is we support public buyers in the risk analysis, the monitoring, the verification, and the remediation process of human rights issues in their electronic supply chains. So these are key steps in the human rights due diligence process. And in our experience, in our practical experience, if there is an independent, democratic, and free trade union involved in this process, this work is just so much easier, so much more efficient, and so much more, economical from a public buyer perspective. So I would say that, if public buyers were to insist on the respect for any one of the range of the fundamental labor rights, the most important is the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining. This is a basic labor rights, but I would encourage you then also to think about the freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining as a very key strategy for doing efficient human rights due diligence. So I just wanted to make that remark. And before Alice, I don't know, maybe you can go over to Elena for her concluding remarks, and I can come back after that unless we have questions.
Yes, thank you, Bjorn. Yes, I would like to give the floor to Elena because, of course, since we are at the end of the series, we will discuss about also the next steps. So happy to give you the floor, Elena.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I would also kind of echo what Bjorn was saying just now. As in the due diligence conversation, speaking about the due diligence, human rights environmental due diligence for companies, and within the legislative processes that are happening right now, it's key also in public procurement to speak more about the inclusion of stakeholders. I think this is something that we noticed throughout the entire series, that it might be even a little bit more difficult than it is in the due diligence framework that is being kind of devised anew for companies to rethink how public procurement processes are carried out so that there is genuine stakeholder engagement, because that is key in introducing better sustainability standards, especially human rights or environmental standards that have specific impacts on groups. And that is true for trade unions. These are perfect partners, but it also needs to be true for other communities in global value chains and other communities, other rights holders, groups in global value chains. I know that this can be difficult, so it's just the start of a conversation, but I think it's important to always keep it in mind, thinking about what needs to be done in the future, that whatever that is needs to give an active role to voices of rights holders in global value chains. Because that can also be very effective support, really. Yeah, just to add to it's a business case really to including them. If nothing, not even for the business, just for the effectiveness of the diligence itself. The aims cannot be reached if the positions of stakeholders on each step of the due diligence process, what are the risks, what kind of measures need to be devised so that they are actually effective. So in collaborating with buyers that are facing risks or might be facing risks, the rights holders in that situation are the ones that will have the best answers or the best input to what answers to choose. Yeah, so I wanted to emphasize that again at the end of the series, I think, and it was a really nice transition also from the last presentation. So that would be, I think, yeah, going forward, really approaching this conversation very communally.
Thank you very much, Elena, for your words. I would like now to give the floor again to Bjorn and then to Elena again to explain to the participants what are your plans also for the months to come in this area.
Thank you very much, Alice. So I want to thank, first of all, I want to thank the presenters for really thoughtful and super interesting presentations. I think it's been a really great way to end this webinar series. So we're coming to the end of the series, but of course we're not coming to the end of our work on human rights due diligence in public procurement. So each one of us would like to give you now the highlights of our ongoing work, so that so that you can join up wherever it seems useful to you. So I'm going to start with what comes next for Electronics Watch. Very simply, we are of course continuing to support our affiliated public buyers to incorporate human rights and environmental due diligence throughout the ICT tender and contract management process. As you heard, Stefan was explaining at the very beginning, that there's a tender process, which is a long process in and of itself, and then there's a contract management process, which is even longer. And throughout these processes, we're looking for ways in which you can incorporate the human rights due diligence perspective, and by doing so, drive accountability and respect for worker rights in the global supply chains of the ICT products that you're buying. In addition to supporting this process ourselves with our affiliated public buyers, we do also connect our affiliates to their peers in neighboring countries, in countries far away, who are doing interesting work in this area. And I want to emphasize that there's a whole lot of very interesting work that is being done by our affiliates in this case. But just to mention one example, I spoke with them before this call, so they wanted me to highlight. This is a group of Swedish public buyers who, in January 2023, they will launch new contract conditions in order to align their due diligence requirements in contracts with the UNGP and with the OECD guidance and with the pending Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So their language, the contract language, is available. I think it will be available in English soon if it isn't already. But in addition to the actual language, what is super helpful is that they have developed a very extensive guidance and templates for both procurers and the suppliers for how to comply with these due diligence requirements. This year, we have also launched a low emissions vehicle program, and we are now working with 9 public buyers to develop human rights due diligence tools and approaches that are specific to this very sector. This, by focusing on low emission vehicles, of course, we are combining the environmental and the social perspective. Low emission vehicles as being integral to reaching the climate goals. But if you only focus on the vehicles themselves and the technologies of the batteries without the social aspects of human rights due diligence, then we will not reach even the climate goals. That's our perspective here. So we want to have a combined systemic perspective on economic, social, and environmental measures together. And this year, we have also been very fortunate to be able to launch an innovation program that explores how public buyers can implement human rights due diligence across their supply chains based upon the electronic watch impact model. As one example here, we're currently scoping the food value chain. So lots of interesting work coming along in different sectors here. I also want to mention that we have a particular focus right now on one of the key building blocks of the due diligence process, that is the right to effective remedy. We are working here with public buyers, trade unions, and others to develop a framework and principles and also practical tools for worker-driven remedy of human rights violations in global supply chains. And we will be taking steps over the coming years to apply this framework and these tools to the public procurement process. I want to also acknowledge and highlight the fact that there is a legal basis for our work on remedy and remediation that has been developed by Martina Trusknak and Olga Martin Ortega of the Business, Human Rights and Environmental Research Group at the University of Greenwich. And this study, this briefing that they developed, is available publicly on our website. So if any of this looks of interest to you, we very much invite you to contact us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bjorn. And since I'm giving the floor to Elena to conclude the webinar, I also want to thank you for the opportunity to moderate this webinar. It was very fruitful and inspiring, I hope, for all participants. Happy to give the floor again for the last time to Elena Lunder, my former colleague from FTAO.
Thank you, Alice. I also wanted to briefly fly over the next steps that the FTAO will be taking within this both due diligence and in public procurement. Which just a second, I can also share. I'm sorry. Oh, do you see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay. Then I apologize. Here you go. Yes. Now probably.
Yes.
Thanks. So yeah, generally we focus a lot on human rights and environmental due diligence, but as a separate file that currently does not contain any elements of public procurement. This was included initially, but later on just noticed that for that revision of 2014 directives would be necessary, and this would not be possible within the current commission that is in office until 2024. So they no longer have time to carry this out, and it was taken out of the content of the due diligence directive proposal. So one of our key aims in relation to combining the two fields is our work on making sure that the next commission, so the commission starting their 5-year mandate in 2024, has as one of their commitments to do a revision of the 2014 directives to ensure that the minimum mandatory criteria on sustainability standards that is now being developed in sector-specific questions, I will just get to that in a second, becomes mandatory, so that it's not really up to the public procurers, or that public procurers don't need to run the risk of not knowing how to specifically implement something, fearing that would not be in line with the 2014 directive. So that needs to be clarified for sure. And as part of that, it's coherence with the corporate sustainability due diligence as a sanction needs to be established. So it would be, for example, a good outcome if both instruments could collaborate in a way that companies could not apply in public procurement processes if they are in breach of their due diligence obligation. So that would be an automatic disqualifier. For that, we are already connecting with members of the European Parliament, with whom we would jointly push for this commitment by the Commission in about a year. So this is more of a long-term plan that we are slowly working on. And at the same time, my colleagues working on textiles and food are engaging with a mandatory green public procurement criteria that is being developed as part of sectoral guidance. So there is an instrument, Farm to Fork, within which such criteria was supposed to be developed last year, and it still hasn't been published by the Commission. They're running against a lot of problems. But the main aim in the work with the Commission, so advocacy towards the Commission, is to ensure that when we speak about sustainability criteria, we are not only speaking about environmental factors, but also social. And the same is true for the textile strategy, which refers to minimum mandatory green public procurement criteria. So again, there the main aim is to make the case that that is not possible to do without also addressing social aspects. So within that, we always welcome collaborations with actors from different fields because it helps us to build the case. So our focus here is advocacy work, but any kind of so exchanges like this series of webinars really help us build a more robust argument in favor of this point. So if in the future you are interested in these elements or would have other evidence to support these calls, please reach out. We will be very happy to hear from you. And then just briefly, because this webinar series was organized jointly between Electronics Watch, Industrial, and the FTAO. I will also share the next steps that were shared by Industrial for us today. I will not go deeper into them because, yeah, it's their next steps. But in general, it's what I described until now: future collaboration amongst our organizations and also those that have joined our conversations in the past year throughout the series. They will continue insisting on inclusion of due diligence clauses in the policies of public procurers, covering the entire supply chain of companies. Maybe better like this. And they will work on informing industrial affiliates and providing training on the use of mechanisms and tools provided within the due diligence legislation that is now being developed at EU level. They will denounce workers' and union rights violations to public procuring organizations buying electronics products, and they will continue developing, modernizing, and updating remediation mechanisms for migrant workers and unions in the electronics industry, which will include work with existing national and European laws on due diligence. So basically, all of our organizations are continuing to work on bringing the two policy processes together. And while this series of webinars was a very, was an initial exchange on what kind of aims we want to see, what kind of challenges we're facing. This is really just the start. So I had a very interesting time with all the speakers and participants, and hope that we continue collaborating in this way.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
I mean, yeah, thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you, Alice, for moderating.
Thank you all speakers, and
Thank
see you at the next series. Bye-bye. Thank you.